Chuba Hubbard was a top 10 back in the NFL in 2024 and is set to be back in Carolina for the next 4 years. But Jonathon Brooks is likely to miss some time again in 2025. With that being said, how should the Panthers approach the offseason here in 2025? I'll tell you right here on Locked On Panthers.
You are Locked On Panthers, your daily Carolina Panthers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of the Locked On Panthers podcast, the part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, as always, Julian Council, talking Carolina Panthers with you every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and yes, of course, Friday, your team every day. That's our motto here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Thanks for watching the show here on YouTube and listening wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Be sure to follow me, Julian Council, over on Twitter at Julian Council. Why? Because on Fridays throughout the offseason, I'm right here on the show answering your weekly Friday mailbag questions, and all you got to do is either at me or DM me over on Twitter at Julian Council to get your questions in for this week's edition of the weekly Friday mailbag right here on Locked On Panthers. Today's episode of Locked On Panthers is brought to you by Prize Picks. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code all lowercase LockedOnNFL to win $50 instantly when you play $5. We're back once again previewing every single position group here in Carolina as we are here in the middle of the 2025 offseason and talking about how the Panthers should approach the offseason for every single position group that they have here. Talked about the quarterbacks yesterday, talked about on the Monday which pending free agents, both unrestricted, restricted, exclusive rights free agents should stay and go here in Carolina, focusing mainly on the big names and the big decisions Carolina has to make. That Dan Morgan, the general manager and president of football operations, and Brant Tillis, the EVP of football operations, have to make as far as what to do with those players. Let's talk today about the running back position and what Carolina should do this offseason with them. First, looking back at 2024, a big question I have for them heading the offseason, and then how they should fully approach things once they do get there in March and the new league year begins on March 13th here in the NFL. We already know, based off of how the Panthers have approached things since Dave Canales came here as Panthers head coach, that running backs matter in Carolina. And you know how I feel about running backs financially. Obviously, they're an important part of your offense. We have seen that look at the Philadelphia Eagles with Saquon Barkley. They're going to the Super Bowl in large part because Saquon Barkley has been one of the best players in the NFL this past season. I just look in past years in Carolina when they had McCaffrey, in years where, like Chuba Hubbard this season, played well, that has not necessarily resulted in the Panthers, like the Eagles, going to the Super Bowl. Why is that? Well, Panthers' offensive line, while improved, is not as good as the Eagles' offensive line. Their defense certainly is not anywhere near as good as Vic Fangio's defense there in Philly. You got to have a complete team effort. Obviously, the running back is a piece of that. They're not necessarily the piece, as we've seen in the last couple of years, as Carolina, unfortunately, has not been in the playoffs. But Chuba Hubbard showed this past year that he certainly is a piece worth keeping around for the years to come after he had career highs in rushing attempts, 250, and rushing yards with 1,195. Both were 12th and 8th, respectively, in the NFL this past season. Look at 2023 and 2024 combined for Chuba Hubbard. He has rushed for over 2,000 yards the past two seasons. He's been nails, and he is honestly a great story and exactly what you want. We talked about this a couple of days ago when looking back at Dan Morgan's first draft class and how he was able to find guys in day 3 and who were also undrafted to come in and be contributors, be starters here in Carolina this past season. You look at Chuba Hubbard, he's had to be that since he was selected in the 4th round out of Oklahoma State. And hat tip to Julie Rule, Matt Rule's wife, who said, "Hey, Matt, remember back when we were at Baylor and there was that guy up there in Stillwater who ran all over our ass? You should draft him. He's available." Well, Julie Rule, fantastic scouting by you, honey, because you got it right. You nailed it. The one good thing, one of the few good things that Matt Rule didn't, he didn't do very many good things here in Carolina, was listening to his wife, his better half, clearly, and going out there and getting Chuba Hubbard, who has become the lead back in Carolina, had to go in there when Christian McCaffrey had that hamstring injury there in the middle of that 2021 season. That happened on that Thursday night game on the road against Houston. Chuba had to be the lead back after that. Of course, Christian came back, but still, Chuba got a lot of valuable reps there in 2021, 2022. Panthers side that we're bad. We're not going to the playoffs this year. At least they didn't think so at that point in time. Then they needed to get a quarterback, get some compensation, potentially be in position to better the roster. They trade away Christian McCaffrey to San Francisco. And Chuba Hubbard wasn't actually RB1. It was Deontay Foreman, but it was still a downhill rushing attack with Foreman and with Chuba Hubbard, which was outstanding, led to the greatest offensive performance in the history of this franchise against Detroit on Christmas Eve that season. And then last year, the year after that, rather in 2023, Chuba Hubbard came in as the number 2 back as Carolina with Frank Reich and with Deuce Staley as running backs coach decided, let's spend the most money on any free agent running back on Miles Sanders, who came in, had a groin injury in the preseason, and then never really looked like the Miles Sanders who was a Pro Bowler the year prior when Philadelphia went to the Super Bowl and lost to the Chiefs. Same team they're going to be playing again on Sunday coming up here in a week's time. And he just wasn't good. But Chuba Hubbard won the job, ran for 900 yards, came back this year as the clear number 1 running back. And looking at those numbers again, 250 yards rushing, 250 rushing attempts, 12th most rather in the NFL, 1,195 yards, the 8th most in the NFL this past season. He played like a top 10 back in 2024. Looking at rushing success rate, brought this up a lot this past season for Chuba. 54.8% was 5th best among running backs, 200 plus carries in the NFL this past season. Looking at PFF, though, they didn't really love Chuba Hubbard as far as his overall offensive grade, where they're looking at his receiving ability, obviously his running ability, his pass blocking ability, which is also very important for running back. He was only 18th. When you look just purely at him as a runner, Chuba Hubbard had the 10th best grade. So clearly he was a top 10 back based off of rushing yardage, rushing success rate, the rushing grade that PFF put out there. You cannot argue that Chuba Hubbard was not a top 10 back in the NFL this past season. And the Carolina Panthers saw how he was performing. They were about to fly to Munich, and they said, we got to give you this money, Chuba. You've been awesome. You have fit in. You have helped establish the culture here that Dave Canales wants to establish. They gave him a 4-year, $33.2 million extension that could be worth up to $37 million before flying over to Munich. And what did he do that Sunday in Germany against the Giants? Well, he had a career day. 28 carries, 153 yards, and a touchdown in that overtime win against the Giants. How many guys out there get paid like Chuba Hubbard did and then go out there and have a career day in their next game? Miles Sanders got paid and never has had a day like that in his 2 seasons in Carolina. We're going to talk about him momentarily here on the show, but Chuba Hubbard is absolutely the kind of guy that you want to build around. You know how I feel about paying running backs, and yes, it did make my skin crawl a little bit when I first saw the news, but then I thought to myself, yeah, well, he's been pretty good. Running backs matter here. That's not a crazy kind of deal that they're giving him. It's not like the $16 million that they gave Christian McCaffrey, and he certainly is not at that level of Christian McCaffrey or at the level of Saquon Barkley there in Philadelphia, but he is a solid back, and it's not going to be backbreaking. It's really a 2-year deal the Panthers can get out of after that if they want to. And looking at the state of affairs, it was a pretty prescient move by Dan Morgan and Dave Canales and Brant Tillis to go out there to give Chuba Hubbard that extension, because Jonathon Brooks, who they traded up for in the 2nd round to be their future running back, retore his ACL, the same race ACL in that right knee that he tore, 13 months prior. So 2 times in 13 months, torn right ACL, only played 3 games this past season, only had 9 rushing attempts for 22 yards, 3 receptions for 23 yards. We did see a little bit of what made Carolina attracted to him and willing to risk taking a guy who was clearly not going to be available for a number of weeks and months, as we found out after he was drafted. He looked pretty solid, and just the limited snaps that we saw from him, PFF grade, which really not that far fair, was a 61.5. But look at, honestly, the receiving grade, when you look at just the amount of snaps he played, just looking at all running backs and ignoring the snap minimum, he had an 83.5 receiving grade. That was only behind Bucky Brooks there in Tampa Bay. Had an 82.2 pass blocking grade. That was first among all the running backs. So he clearly has talent, is going to be somebody who can contribute. The question just is, when is he going to be able to contribute? And actually, will he be able to contribute, considering he has not been healthy here in Carolina? So it's a great thing that the Panthers did pay Chuba Hubbard, and that Chuba Hubbard played as well as he played this past season, as he will be once again in 2025 once we get to the season, RB1. And looking at how things are going so far, probably going to be the case again in 2026, as I don't expect Jonathon Brooks to be really healthy for the majority of the season. Maybe he comes back and plays. It's tough. I don't know if it's easier or harder after tearing ACL for the second time in the same knee to come back. He certainly knows what goes into it rehab-wise, the mental capacity he has to have and things he got to get over as far as being able to cut and do all that. Took him a while. Took a lot longer than Ian Rappaport, and I'm guessing Jonathon Brooks camp told us when they said he'd be ready to go July 1. He was not ready to go until, what was it, like November 12th when he came back there against Kansas City. So we'll see how that plays out, but that certainly is going to impact how the Panthers potentially are going to go out there and attack the running back position this offseason. And they have another running back in-house who they paid a lot of money to 2 years ago, and he has not come anywhere close to living up to that deal. But he did leave a nice final impression in 2024 and really the start of 2025, and that is Miles Sanders. So with Jonathon Brooks likely to miss some time, should the Panthers keep Miles Sanders for another year? We'll talk about that here in just a moment on Locked On Panthers. The big game is almost here, and there's no better way to make it even more exciting than with Prize Picks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. With over 10 million members and billions in winnings awarded, Prize Picks makes it fun and simple to get in on the action. Here's how it works. You pick more or less on at least 2 players' stat projections, and if you're right, you can win up to 1,000 times your cash. Prize Picks even has a free pick for the big game where one of the starting quarterbacks only needs to throw for 1 yard to win. So Patrick Mahomes, Jalen Hurts, 1 yard, and you easily get a win right there. Pair that with one more correct pick, and you're cashing out. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONNFL for $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks, run your game. 2 years ago, the Carolina Panthers signed Miles Sanders to a 4-year, $25.4 million contract with $13 million in guaranteed, including a $5.9 million signing bonus. And there are roster bonuses on the third day of 2025 and 2026 league years, which will be important to this conversation we're going to have right now. As again, Jonathon Brooks, the second-round pick out of the University of Texas, retore his right ACL in that Eagles game immediately in that first quarter, unfortunately, on the road in that loss that Sunday up in Philadelphia, and is likely going to miss a significant amount of time in the 2025 season if we're just going to base it off of how long it took him to come back. And again, I have no idea. Never tore my ACL, knock on wood, thank God. And so I have no idea. Obviously, didn't play in the NFL, so I don't know how long it takes truly to come back from that after it's already happened to you one time. But we know he tore his ACL in November at Texas, late November, and it took him until mid-November the following year to be back. So nearly a calendar year for Jonathon Brooks to be out there. And you have to also wonder if the Panthers really needed him, would he have come back earlier? He didn't. They didn't necessarily need him because Chuba Hubbard was outstanding in 2024, and they may not need him to come back very early at all in 2025 as well, assuming that everything, knock on wood again, goes well and Chuba Hubbard plays well and Carolina maybe brings somebody else in or maybe keeps Miles Sanders, which is part of the conversation. Should Miles Sanders return knowing that he's been around the last couple of seasons? He's been in this scheme, left a nice impression there in that walk-off win on the road against Atlanta in Week 18, and that Chuba Hubbard is the top guy, and he's going to need some support, and Carolina believes that running backs matter here, and he still has 2 more years left on his deal. So looking at things with Miles Sanders and whether he should have an argument, or if there is an argument at all, for him to come back while Jonathon Brooks misses some time this upcoming season. Look at 2024, the stats, not impressive. 55 carries, 205 yards, 2 touchdowns, 24 receptions, 148 yards, and a touchdown. And a lot of that production came in Week 18 when he was back to being the guy. Chuba was out, that calf injury. Jonathon Brooks, of course, was out for the season. The previous week, the backs did not look good against Tampa Bay, so they got to a point where, all right, we got Miles Sanders back. He came back off of IR where he had missed 5 weeks of the ankle injury suffered in Munich and not winning against the Giants. He had 17 carries for 66 yards and a touchdown, 3 receptions, 50 yards, and a touchdown as well. So an outstanding game for Miles Sanders to get another opportunity to be willing to play and wanting to be back out there. And Dave Canales said leading up to that week, if guys are ready to go, we're going to play them. We're not looking at this as, oh, it's week 18. We're not going to worry about it. Let guys who are injured rest. No, we are trying to win this game. We're trying to continue to establish this culture and start things correctly in 2025. And Miles Sanders was on board, as he should be. Things have not worked out for him in Carolina. He came in to be the top back, had the groin injury, wasn't great. Chuba Hubbard went out there, stole his job, and didn't even stole it, just took it, earned it on the field with his play, and Miles has been a backup since then. And it's unfortunate that that's how things panned out for him, but that's just how it happens in the NFL, and why you don't pay running backs as much money, especially if they're not Saquon Barkley. But either way, like it was a good year for a lot of running backs out there who got paid. Josh Jacobs there in Green Bay, and looking at Aaron Jones in Minnesota. Those are guys who are a little bit better, obviously, than Miles Sanders, but still, he had a good game at the end of the year, and he left a great impression on Carolina. But the problem is the contract. He has an $8 million cap hit coming up here in 2025. And do you really want your backup running back having the highest cap hit among the running backs on the roster? You look at it, Chuba Hubbard's cap hit is $5.5 million, and Jonathon Brooks is $1.9 million. Combine those together, and that is less than what Miles Sanders' cap hit is. And Carolina is going to have to find a way to open up some room to go out there and be aggressive, smart, but aggressive as far as things go with free agents upcoming here in March. I don't know if it makes a lot of sense to have Miles Sanders on that kind of cap hit. And certainly it's far lesser than what Taylor Moton currently has, which is $31 million. But like Moton, I don't see Moton playing on a $31 million cap hit. I don't think Miles Sanders, as your backup running back who has failed to live up to expectations. Like, understand this. He's rushed for 637 yards into 2 seasons here in Carolina. Those combined, the 2 seasons, yardage-wise, is lower than any of the full seasons that he played in Philadelphia. And mind you, he played in 16 games back during the 2023 season. Yes, he lost his job in the middle of that, but still, he played a full season. And just not great for Miles Sanders. And the dead money, this is the thing. If they want to cut him pre-June 1, the dead money is $2.9 million. They would save $5.2 million if they decide to cut him pre-June 1. And another big key, and I brought this up when reading out that contract from overthecap.com, there's a roster bonus of $1 million on the 3rd day of the new league year coming up here in March. And the only reason why Miles Sanders was even on the roster in Carolina this past season, it was because they had a $2 million roster bonus that they really couldn't get out of. They were going to lose $2 million in cap space, and the Panthers were obviously trying to open up cap space, not lose cap space, had they cut him. And they knew that, okay, he can be a backup. It's fine. There's value there in having him on the roster. But if that wasn't something that was an impediment, I'm thinking that Miles Sanders is not a Carolina Panther, and we're not having the conversation that we're having right now about him potentially coming back in 2025. Now, they could potentially decide to rework the deal and find a way to bring that cap hit down, not worry about any dead money, and have Miles Sanders come back in a secondary role once again, but at the kind of total that would make a lot more sense salary-wise for a guy who is going to be RB2 behind Chuba Hubbard and be able to fill that void until Jonathon Brooks is back. Now, he's missed time, understand that, and the groin impacted him, so he's had injuries. So you have to wonder, okay, is he somebody who can hold up there as Chuba has been able to hold up throughout his career in Carolina? Do you want a backup who has had some issues injury-wise last couple seasons? That is certainly something to wonder. So there is an argument for Miles Sanders to come back based off of how he performed in the final week of the season, his experience. And if you're going to sign somebody, you're going to want to sign a veteran. It's not like go draft somebody later on in day 3 and bring him in when you already have Jonathon Brooks, who they still, and Dan Morgan's come out there and said, is going to have a future in Carolina. They still think like he can help them down the road. It's just not going to likely happen in 25, just like it didn't really happen in 2024, unfortunately. So it's possible that Miles Sanders comes back. I don't know necessarily if that is the right move, unless, again, he's willing to rework his deal, make less money, and do something that's far more team-friendly for an opportunity here. Or maybe put out a highlight tape of Week 18, and the rest of the NFL looked at it and said, we want a piece of that. We'll see how it plays out. So how should the Panthers address running back this offseason with Chuba Hubbard clearly as RB1, Miles Sanders having a contract they got to figure out what to deal with, and knowing that Jonathon Brooks is likely not going to be a key factor in 2025. We'll talk about that here in just a moment on Locked On Panthers. This is a message from sponsor Intuit TurboTax. Taxes was waiting and wondering and worrying if you were going to get any money back, and then waiting, wondering, and worrying some more. Now Taxes is matching with a TurboTax expert who can do your taxes as soon as today. An expert who gives your taxes their undivided attention as they work on your return, while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on your day. An expert who will find you every deduction possible and file every form, every investment, everything with 100% accuracy, all so you can get the most money back guaranteed. No waiting, no wondering, no worries. Now this is Taxes. Get an expert now on turbotax.com. So how should the Panthers address running back position this offseason here in 2025? Of course, Chuba Hubbard, he's got his money paid in full. He's going to be back again as RB1. Jonathon Brooks will be on the roster, whether he'll be starting off on the PUP list or whatever it's going to be. We don't know quite yet how long it's going to take for him to be able to be back out there. And I'm sure there's going to be some availabilities coming up here shortly. I know there's a Senior Bowl going on right now, which I don't think that you would hear from Dave and Dan and Brant down there. It would be the Combine at the end of February, be the next time I would imagine that we were going to hear from the Panthers head coach Dave Canales and general manager Dan Morgan. Then after that, you'll hear from them, of course, with free agency, and then after the draft and all that, or before the draft and after the draft. So there are still opportunities in the coming weeks and months to find out his status. But I would guess like in January, there's not going to be much of an update there as far as, yeah, we hope he can be ready to go week one, knowing that probably not going to be ready to go week one, unfortunately. So with that being said, the Panthers are going to have to bring in somebody else to help him back there at RB2. I do think they should cut Miles Sanders, save that $5 million. If he wants to rework a deal and that can help you save cap space, then that would be my preferred scenario, certainly. But if I'm Miles Sanders, maybe he wants to stay here in Carolina. And he did say last year, after having that disappointing season during locker room cleanout day, that he intends to honor his contract. Now, if they want to rework the contract, I don't know necessarily that's him honoring the contract, as the Panthers are saying, let's rip this contract up and do a new one to keep you around. So if he's still willing to honor the fact that he signed in Carolina for 4 years and wants to stick around for another season at a reduced rate, I'm for that. But I do think probably what's going to happen is that they move on from Miles Sanders and they go out there and try to find a veteran running back instead. So who would be the guys that would make sense? I've brought up Javonte Williams' name before, as he's been a top running back before in Denver, and he's been phased out this last season. He would make sense as a backup. He's from North Carolina area. Travis Homer was out there in Seattle with Canales and a large portion of this staff, so he would make sense. Chase Edmonds was with Canales down in Tampa. Like, those are a couple of guys that have, at least those last two, who have connections to this staff. But then you look just at the running back position, period, as far as guys that are going to be free agents upcoming. I mean, Aaron Jones is, but he's not going to be someone that you want to bring in as your top. He's going to be an RB1 somewhere. Same thing with Najee Harris. I mean, but you got like AJ Dillon is a backup upcoming. I already brought up Javonte Williams, Alexander Madison, somebody that can make sense. Travis Homer, who I already brought up as well. I mean, there's Jeff Wilson, J.K. Dobbins. Like, there's a ton of guys who could make sense, like Ty Johnson as a receiving back for Carolina. Cam Akers is available. Mike Boone, that's somebody, him and Raheem Blackshear, both of them are free agents and unrestricted for Mike Boone, restricted for Raheem. I would think that Mike Boone's likely coming back. I would not be surprised if they decide to move on from Raheem Blackshear this offseason. And Jordan Mason, he only made $853,000. I know I said only, it's a lot of money, but not in the NFL. And he was the starting running back for the majority of the year out there in San Francisco, while Christian McCaffrey was trying to figure out the Achilles tendonitis in both of his Achilles. Like, good Lord, man. That would make a lot of sense as a backup. So there are guys out there. And this is why Kenneth Gainwell as well. This is why I say you don't have to pay a guy. You can go get just two guys for peanuts and have them be your top two. But they paid Chuba Hubbard. I understand it. I get it. So there's a lot of options out there. Carolina can find a veteran back who can come in do the exact same job, probably the exact same level that Miles Sanders did it for the last 2 years and be completely fine and still have Chuba be their main guy. So they don't have to keep Miles Sanders around. They can go find somebody off the street. And I think that should be what they do. So obviously Chuba's back. We'll see what happens with Jonathon Brooks and his health status. If Miles wants to rework that deal, cool. If he doesn't, better. Go save the money. Go get somebody for the vet men. No overtime. No holiday pay, none of that. No bonuses, none of that garbage. Federal minimum wage, you know how it is. Use them, abuse them, then lose them after this upcoming season in Carolina. So that is how the Panthers should address the offseason at the running back position here in 2025. That's going to wrap up this edition of the Locked On Panthers podcast by our Locked On Podcast Network, hosted by yours truly, Julian Council. Again, y'all subscribe, follow the show free on YouTube and wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. And be sure to follow me, Julian Council, over on Twitter at Julian Council, where on Friday I'll be back answering your weekly Friday mailbag questions. All you got to do is either at me or DM me to get those questions into me right now. In the meantime, be safe, be happy, be whole. As always, keep pounding it. On tomorrow's show, we're going to take a look at the wide receiver position. Will the Panthers bring in a number one wide receiver, or will they just decide to raise the floor? We'll talk about that here and more on Thursday, on Locked On Panthers.